Welcome to week 2 of the Bowtie Flower Quilt Along. This is the week for cutting your fabric, and for those of you overachievers that I've been seeing on Instagram, good for you. You've already cut your fabric. Some of you have even started sewing. But for those of you who are wanting this as kind of a tutorial, a step-by-step guide, this is for you. So I'm just going to share with you a few things that have helped me as I've gone along quilting. And one of them is planning out your quilt. So I sent a coloring sheet last week, and I'll include that again this week just in case you need it and you don't want to go back and find the email. But I have found it super, super helpful to plan out how I want my quilt to look as far as which fabrics go where. Because, especially with this quilt, it's going to depend on how much fabric you cut and what you need. So for example, these, it's hard to tell. I made this small just so I wouldn't use so much ink when I printed it off. But these two red fabrics are actually different. So I only need one of these bowtie flowers with this red dragonfly fabric. And then again, it's hard to tell, but there's 3 of these, 2 of these. So that's gonna depend that's gonna change how much fabric I'll be cutting. And just to explain, especially if you're newer, and even if you're not, sometimes it's hard to know now, how much fabric do I need if I only am making 1 of this or 2 of that? So in the instructions, and I'll put this close so that you can see it. It's backwards. Okay, well, I'll explain it to you. So in your instructions, it says the bowtie fabric, fabric B, that you'll either need 8 fat quarters or 16 strips that are 10 inch by 21 inch. So total, you're gonna have 16 bowtie flowers. So if you want to make each one different, each bowtie flower is just 10 inches by 21 inches. If you're making 2 of the same ones, you can use a fat quarter. So, and also, to make it easier, I have a cutting diagram for you, and it's really detailed, so you'll want to look at your pattern for this. But it shows you what to cut for if you're making with a fat quarter, so if you're making 2 bowtie flowers, or if you're making 1, that's all you need to cut. So for me, if I'm looking back at my diagram, and I know that I just want 1 of this red dragonfly fabric, I'll go and look and say, okay, I just need to cut this right here. That's enough for 1 bowtie flower. Now for the one where I'm cutting 3, I'm gonna do this fat quarter, which gives me 2, plus this, which gives me 1, so that equals 3. And so on and so forth. If I just want 2 of these, I'll go and use the fat quarter. So that will give me 2 bowtie flowers. So I hope that makes sense. If you have questions on that, let me know. But like I said, it really helps me to know, to diagram out how I want it laid out. And it makes a big difference. I have found that when, let's say I have a red here and a red here, and those are the only 2 reds in the entire quilt, it looks a little off. So I like to play around with the placement of the fabric and to make sure that the darks are equally dispersed and that the lights are equally dispersed, and so that when you look at it, it gives a nice overall effect. So that's my word of advice to get started, is to plan out which fabrics you want in your quilt and how many of each you want, and that will then affect your cutting. So for cutting the fabric, I've actually already cut that red bowtie fabric, or red dragonfly that I mentioned. And so this is everything that I'm gonna need, minus the background fabric. I haven't cut that yet. But this is all I'll need for the 1 bowtie flower. So that's already done. I can set it aside. And then I'll look at my diagram and say, okay, I've got this fabric and I need 2 of those. So I'll look at the cutting diagram, say, okay, for 2, and it has it, granted, this is if you have a traditional fat quarter, if it's cut in the traditional way. If your fat quarter is not cut by the width of fabric, so 42 inches by 18 inches, you'll have to cut yours differently. You'll still need the same number of squares. It just won't be able to lay out as it shows in the instructions. but mine is in the traditional way. So I'm gonna flip this around and show you how I will cut it, just like it shows in the directions. So let me turn this down here. So this is the fabric that I have, and in the instructions, it shows that we cut 3 5-inch squares, and then 2 2.5-inch squares, which equals 5-inch. So 1, 2, 3, 4 5-inch rows, and these are also going to be 5-inch. I'm just going to subcut these into smaller pieces. So I'm not going to actually do this because I only have 2 hands, but I'll kind of show you. I've already trimmed the fabric so that it is straight at the top. So I'm going to line this up and line it up on the left so that it's straight. And then I'll take my ruler and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to check on this side that it's on the line, and on this side that it's on the line. This is where a long ruler, this is a 24.5-inch ruler, it comes in handy. So we line that up, and then I'd hold this with my left hand and with my rotary cutter, cut across. Then leaving the fabric in place, I would move this down and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And straight there, straight there. And then I double count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just to make sure that I have it right. And then I'd cut it. And then when that's done, and I have my 4 rows, then I would bring my ruler this way and cut 5 inches, 5 inches, 5 inches. And then I'd take away those 5-inch squares that I leave as 5 inches, and I would cut these into smaller 2.5 inches. And then I'd have my 2.5 inches. And this, it's folded in half, and so it'll give me double everything that I cut, which the instructions are taking into account. Also, if you didn't notice all that starch, that is like my biggest helpful tip that I can give you is to starch your fabric. So what I do, I'll bring you over and show you my little ironing station. I have my iron right here, and it's actually pretty awesome. It's one of those that just magically goes up. But I have my fabric here. I bring it over, lay it out, I guess right here, lay it out, spray it with starch until it is nice and soaked, and then I iron it until it's dry. And then I flip it over and do the other side, spray it, starch it, and it makes it just nice and crispy, and then the cutting is accurate. Because sometimes when you cut, if it's not accurate, it leads to troubles down the road where you're like, why aren't my points meeting up? Why is this a little off? If you use starch in your fabric, I wish I could have you feel this fabric. It's just almost like, not as thick as cardstock, but it just has a little weight to it, a little crispiness, and it just helps that cutting and the piecing to be more accurate. So if you can get starch, I would recommend doing that. Those are my tips for cutting this week, cutting your fabric, and make sure to post a picture somehow of either your cut fabric, of you in the process of cutting, anything with cutting your fabric, along with the hashtags Bowtie Flower QAL and Bowtie Flower Quilt Along, and you will be entered to win this week's prize. So, as usual, let me know if you have any questions. I am happy to help. I am here for you. And thank you for joining with this. It's super fun to have you all here. I hope you've been looking at the hashtags and seeing everything that everyone's making, because it's pretty cool. There's some pretty neat quilts out there. All right, have fun.